What does the Graf Zeppelin, the Boeing B52, and the Virgin Atlantic Global Flyer all have in common? Let's find out on this episode of Celebrating Aviation with Mike Mashat. What these three aircraft have in common is they all flew around the world. The two jets did it nonstop. So we're going to talk about flying around the world from 1924 to today. The first airplanes to do this were the Douglas World Cruisers. Leaving Santa Monica, California in March of 24, the flight took 6 months and made 62 stops. The airplanes had a top speed of 100 miles per hour. But the significance of this is that these were Army biplanes, each with a crew of two, a pilot and a mechanic. They left Santa Monica on wheels, flew to Seattle, and then were converted to float airplanes. And the reason for this is that the trip was made at a time when there were not a lot of airports. There were no nav aids. It was a very early time in aviation. So these aircraft landed in port cities primarily and next to Navy ships that were stationed along the route in areas that were in between the large cities. 5 airplanes departed. 3 made it all the way around the world. There was no loss of life. It was an amazing accomplishment. One airplane was lost in a weather accident. The other was lost being towed at sea. But the 3 airplanes that made the trip back, and I should mention were converted back to wheels on the East Coast and then flew back to California across country, were symbolic of what the Douglas Aircraft Company was at that time. And so those 3 airplanes became part of the new logo for the company, and the slogan became "First Around the World." I mentioned this, and I'd like to take just a moment to talk about how this translated to the company history into World War II. The 3 airplanes and the world were still part of the logo in the 1940s, and into the jet age with the DC-8, and even into the space age, modified now with a missile and an orbital trail around a globe. But when McDonnell merged with Douglas in 1967, that logo was retained. And when Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas in 1997, the logo was modified once again. But I wanted to mention this because when you look at the current Boeing logo with the circle representing the Earth and the orbit representing around the world, just remember that that began with the Douglas World Cruisers in 1924. The next aircraft to make the around the world flight was the Graf Zeppelin in August of 1929. The Zeppelin had a top speed of 80 miles per hour. This is an unusual air-to-air photo when you think back to that time period. But the Zeppelin made the trip in 4 stops and took 21 days and 5 hours. Now, in this photo, we see the Graf Zeppelin at what is called Mines Field. And today that's LAX, Los Angeles International Airport. This is a view looking to the south. At the right, just below the nose of the Zeppelin, you can see the Palos Verdes Peninsula. But if we turn around and look to the north today, this is what the scene looks like. Just about the same spot. Pretty amazing. This photo gives you a look at the immensity of this machine. The Zeppelin was 776 feet long, on the ground 110 feet high. The max gross takeoff weight was 200,000 pounds. It carried 20 passengers and a crew of 36. The Graf Zeppelin was also the world's first aircraft to launch passenger service across the North Atlantic in October of 1928, just 1 year after Lindbergh's historic flight. Next up, we have the Lockheed Vega, a single-engine monoplane. In June of 1931, this gentleman flew it. This is Wiley Post. Accompanied with a navigator, he flew the Winnie Mae that you see here at Floyd Bennett Field in New York. The trip took 8 days, 16 hours, and made 13 stops. Here we see the Graf Zeppelin again with the Dornier Wulf, which is German for whale. And both these aircraft flew around the world. The Dornier Wulf flight, July of 1932, became the first transglobal flight by a seaplane and also the first westbound round the world flight. It was made as a demonstration tour and billed as a training flight for German air power at that time. Here's a photo of the wall over Havana, Cuba. The trip was made in 3 months and 20 days with 25 stops. And again, speed was not the main motivation here. It was just a demonstration tour of the airplane around the world. We're back to the Lockheed Vega in July of 1933, when Wiley Post made the first solo round the world flight using an autopilot and radio direction finder. Here we see Post with the Winnie Mae again, with the nomenclature of the world flights on the aft fuselage. And that second trip took 7 days, 19 hours with 11 stops. Then came Howard Hughes. 5 years later, after the solo flight by Wiley Post, Hughes flew the Lockheed Super Electra in 1938. This airplane had a top speed of 232 miles per hour. Accompanied with a crew of 3, Hughes is seen here taking off from Burbank Airport on his way to Floyd Bennett Field, the official launch of the world flight. That was completed in 3 days, 19 hours with 7 stops. And here we see a map by the great Ron Davies, and this shows the world flights from 1933 to 1938. Interesting to see the routing. You see the Wiley Post solo flight at top in black, the Hughes flight in red, and at bottom is the Amelia Earhart world flight attempt in 1937. Here we see the Lockheed airplane at Floyd Bennett Field with Hughes and the crew being mobbed by the press. These flights were very exciting at the time. They really captured the public's imagination, and they projected the progress in aviation as well. Now we come to the first commercial airliner to fly around the world, and that trip happened by accident. I'll tell you why. The Boeing 314 flying boat left Treasure Island in San Francisco on December 2nd, 1941. And on December 7th, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the airplane was in Auckland, New Zealand. It was unable to fly eastbound back across the Pacific with war raging at that time. And so it flew westbound and took about a month to reach New York's LaGuardia Airport on January 6, 1942. The first woman to fly around the world, accompanied by a navigator in a Vultee Valiant, is Ricarda Morrow Tate, who made the flight in August of 1949. Now, the first nonstop flight around the world was accomplished by a Boeing B50 Super Fortress in 1949 as well. This airplane had an average speed of 249 miles per hour. And that is the Lucky Lady 2, this B50 Super Fortress, which is an advancement of the original B-29. That trip was made in 3 days and 22 hours with 4 aerial refuelings from a KB-29 tanker. KB-29s were later modified with flying booms that you see here, and then a greater capacity with the KC-97 Strato freighter. And along came the jet age KC-135 Strato tanker, but I mention this because the KC-135 did not become operational until June of 1957. In January of 1957, Boeing B-52s made a round-the-world flight, average speed 534 miles per hour. 5 Boeing B-52 Strato Fortress jet bombers of the United States Air Force Strategic Air Command 93rd Bomb Wing departed Castle Air Force Base near Merced, California, flying nonstop around the world. The mission was named Operation Power Flight. 3 of the B-52s completed the 24,300-mile flight in 1 day, 22 hours, with 4 aerial refuelings. Now take a look at this photo. Again, the 52s had a refuel from KC-97s. The KC-97s were heading downhill. The B-52s with landing gear and flaps deployed were hanging on. But they did this 4 times and got around the world. Here's the 3 airplanes that completed the journey at March Air Force Base in Riverside, California. Well, if you think that was cool, the world got quite a shock in April of 1961 with the Vostok spacecraft carrying the first manned Earth orbital mission. The duration of the single orbit flight was 108 minutes. The speed on orbit was 17,500 miles per hour. And here's the hero of the Soviet Union, Yuri Gagarin, who made that historic flight, beating the US into space with the manned space program. On September 30th, 1964, Jerry Mock, seen here, became the first woman pilot to fly solo around the world in her Cessna 180, Spirit of Columbus. The first transglobal flight over the North and South Poles was made by a Flying Tiger Boeing 707 with a 5-man crew in November of 1965. And the first solo flight over the North and South Pole took place in January of 1971. Pilot's name was Elgin Long. On September 30th, 1982, Ross Perot Jr. and co-pilot Jay Coburn completed the first round-the-world flight by helicopter, landing their Spirit of Texas at its starting point in Dallas. They flew the single-engine Bell 206 Long Ranger more than 26,000 miles, making 56 stops in 26 countries during the 29-day trip. Top speed of the copter was 111 miles per hour. And in this photo, you can see the large fuel tank that was added in the rear cabin. I love this one, the fastest non-orbital global circling flight made by an Air France Concorde in October of 92, 32 hours, 49 minutes. And what's really amazing is that this airplane never saw a sunset. At Mach 2, it was literally racing the sun around the Earth for the whole flight. Pretty cool. Now we have the first nonstop global balloon flight, the Breitling Orbiter 3 in March of 1999. The balloon achieved a maximum ground speed of over 100 miles per hour. Bertrand Piccard, descendant of the famed Piccard explorers, and Brian Jones flew this aircraft. 19 days and 2 hours. Now, it's interesting. It's a technicality, but I'm going to mention it anyway. It's the longest duration unrefueled flight of an aircraft in aviation history. I can already hear you typing in the comments. I know, the Hacienda Cessna 172. If you've ever been to McCarran Airport in Las Vegas, you can see this historic airplane hanging from the ceiling in the terminal, which is pretty cool. But this Cessna 172 was flown for a publicity flight for the Hacienda Hotel in 1958, refueling from trucks. And believe it or not, folks, this airplane stayed in the air. Are you ready? 64 days. It got a lot of attention. The airplane was highly modified. They were able to change the oil and in flight, including the oil filter, and it was quite a spectacle. But this thing stayed in the air for more than 2 months. So yes, longer than the balloon, but the balloon claims the official record as longest flight. Here we have the airplane that made the first round the world nonstop unrefueled flight in history in 1986, the Rutan Voyager. We see it here on takeoff from Edwards Air Force Base, runway 04. You notice the wings are drooping from the weight of the fuel. And during the takeoff roll, those winglets were actually scraped right off the end of the wing, but the airplane became airborne. And it left December 14th, 1986 from Edwards. It took 9 days and 4 minutes. And again, the first nonstop unrefueled flight in history. Airplane had a top speed of 122 miles per hour. It was flown by Dick Rutan, brother of designer Burt, and Gina Yeager, no relation to Chuck. Here we can see them on the lake bed after they returned from the historic flight. And this gives you an idea of the immensity of the airplane. It was quite large. It's now hanging in the south lobby of the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Well, we go from the first nonstop unrefueled flight to the first jet-powered nonstop unrefueled flight flown by Steve Fawcett. The Virgin Global Flyer made 2 flights about a year apart. The top speed of this airplane was 342 miles per hour. The longest flight was 26,300 miles, and the fastest flight was 2 days, 19 hours. Quite a difference from the Voyager's 9-day flight. As you can see, the airplane is essentially 2 giant flying fuel tanks joined by more fuel tanks in the wings and the center pod there with the pilot and the Williams jet engine. Very innovative machine. And again, 2 separate flights about a year apart. Now we come to the first solar powered world flight. This is a photo of the Solar Impulse 1, which was the predecessor of the actual global flight made by the Solar Impulse 2. Due to copyright issues, I'm not able to show any photos of that aircraft, but it was similar to this. Again, we have Bertrand Piccard from the balloon flight and his co-pilot Andre Borschberg launching on March 9th, 2015, and completing the flight in July of 2016. They had a number of problems along the way, but they did persevere and continued, made it all the way around in a solar-powered airplane. The oldest person to fly around the world solo was Fred Lasby at 82 years old in 1994 in a Piper Comanche. And here we have a 19-year-old Belgian aviator named Zara Rutherford, who became the youngest woman to fly around the world solo on January 20th, 2022. She's also the first pilot to make that journey in a light sport aircraft. As this video is being recorded, her 16-year-old brother Mac is in the air attempting to break her record. I should mention that their parents are both pilots. So there you have it, a look at flights around the world from 1924 to today. I thank you for celebrating aviation with Mike Machat. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And until next time, take care.